My name is Steve Higgins, and I direct the Vermont Center on Behavior and Health. And I want to welcome you to today's lecture. And it is the final lecture in the 2021 lecture series. So I'm really excited that today we have Dr. Mark Bouton with us. It's an honor that I get to introduce Mark. But before I do that, just a couple of housekeeping points. So we're going to ask you to hold your questions until Mark is through with his lecture, and to please send them through the Q&A button. You can interact with each other through the chat mechanism, but for questions to Mark, please go through the Q&A, and then he will field those after his lecture. So as I mentioned, it's an honor to introduce my colleague and friend, Mark Bouton, who is the University Distinguished Professor of Psychological Science here at the University of Vermont. And I want to quickly mention that the University Distinguished Professor status is a status that's held by a maximum of only 10 scholars at the university at any one time. So it shows what high regard we hold Mark in here at the University of Vermont. And of course, that's true nationally and internationally for Mark as well. As many of you know, Mark's an expert in learning and conditioning. Indeed, he's the author of a textbook that's entitled something close to that, Learning and Behavior, widely used and highly regarded textbook. He's had a distinguished career, went to great schools. He did his undergraduate training in psychology at Williams College, a very distinguished liberal arts college here in the US, and then his PhD at the University of Washington, where he studied with the very influential learning theorist Robert Bowles. Mark came to UVM. He finished his PhD in 1980 and came right to the University of Vermont as his first faculty position, and has been here ever since. That's 41 years now. I was just joking with Mark. He's one of the few guys I meet on campus who have been here longer than me. So that's always fun. Mark has received many national awards. I could spend a lot of time talking about them all, but just a couple examples. The W. Horsley Gantt Medal from the Pavlovian Society. It's a society that Mark's been active and is very influential in. He was a Fulbright scholar, an editor of one of the American Psychological Association's flagship journals, Experimental Psychology, Animal Behavior Processes. He's been continuously funded, had external funding since 1981 that cuts across funding agencies, including the National Science Foundation, the NIH, National Institutes of Health, including the NIMH Institute, and that's the National Institute of Mental Health, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Mark's best known for his seminal research on the contextual control of extinction and other behavioral processes. There's no question about that. He's the world's leader on that topic. His work is followed closely. He's got more than 27,000 citations to his many publications. He's a dedicated and accomplished teacher and mentor. Indeed, anyone who has studied psychology at the University of Vermont in the last 41 years is likely to have taken a course with Mark Bouton. So I'm really, again, I want to say how thrilled I am to have Mark with us today. And Mark, I appreciate you taking time for your busy schedule. And so I want to turn the floor over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Steve. That was very, very nice, very sweet. I appreciate it. And I appreciate everybody coming today. It's kind of a nice opportunity to talk about things I've been doing for a long time, and some things that we're just starting to do now, actually. Let's see if I can share my screen. Is that working? Can you all see that?
Looks good, Mark.
Yes, we can, Mark.
Thank you very much. Great. Okay, well, wonderful. I thought I would just jump right in and talk about what I want to talk about, or at least tell you what I want to talk about. And I think we'll be able to get through everything. I want to start by talking about extinction, which is something which, as Steve says, we've been worrying a lot about in my lab for years. It's a basic form of behavior change, I want to argue. And I want to illustrate this point that the context is so crucial in both Pavlovian and operant extinction. We also know that context is crucial in other types of behavior change, and I'll focus a bit on punishment and omission or abstinence learning. And then I'll make the point that there are lots and lots of different kinds of contexts, which makes what we're talking about, I think, very general. And then what I want to do is switch a bit and talk about a topic that I've become very interested in, and that is goal-directed actions versus habits. Goal-directed actions are wonderful things that allow us to get through life, but after repetition and practice, and especially if we're taking drugs at the same time, goal-directed actions can become habits, and this has become an important idea in theories of addiction. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work we've been doing recently on making habits and then some on breaking habits. And then I want to just try to integrate everything I've talked about. I'll talk about our new view that the action to habit conversion is just another form of behavior change. And that habit, this important thing we're studying, does not erase goal direction, but like extinction, it interferes with it in a context-specific way. So we're putting everything together in a big package here for you, and I hope it floats. And then I'll close with a couple of thoughts and implications for addiction. So this is extinction, if you've forgotten what extinction is, in both Pavlovian learning and in instrumental or operant learning. I will say that my students and I spent quite a lot of time thinking about extinction in Pavlovian learning, where we were often talking about fear or threat learning. So a cue might be associated with a shock in a rodent, and then we perform exposure therapy by presenting the cue, the tone, whatever it is, over and over and over without shock. Fear goes away. About 10, 12 years ago, we decided to get much more into operant learning, where we're really talking about rodents in my lab. They're learning to do things like press a lever or pull a chain in order to get a food reward. And the whole point of that is that that's because that is the field's model of voluntary behavior, right? That's why we do this. So we're looking at voluntary behavior, and we find similar messages when we look at extinction of voluntary behavior. The behavior will be reinforced, but then when we withhold reinforcement, the behavior goes away. The theme of all this work for years has been that extinction looks like an erasure effect, but in fact, it is not an erasure effect. What's going on is we're learning to inhibit something, and that inhibition turns out to be incredibly specific to the context. So when we talk about extinction in Pavlovian learning, it's as if, for example, the tone that means shock now also means no shock. It's a cue that has two meanings, and its ambiguity is resolved by the context. Similar processes involved in instrumental learning. So I'm going to illustrate that now and then get into some of these other things on action and habit learning, if you'll bear with me. So this is an ancient experiment. I love to do this. Steve, you've already dated me, so I will date myself further by talking about a paper I published while I was already an assistant professor here. And it identifies something we call the renewal effect. And this is in Pavlovian fear conditioning. Basically, we have a very simple experimental design where in one context, a context in my lab is a kind of Skinner box with a particular kind of floor, different visual stimuli, tactile stimuli, odors, spatial location in the lab. The animals in this experiment got tone shock pairings, fear conditioning. This causes fear to be elicited by the tone. And then they got exposure therapy, extinction, tone alone, now either in the same context, context A, or in a different context, context B. And these are always fully counterbalanced and so on and so forth. But then in the long run, at the end, we test all the animals back in context A. So for this group, the animals are simply tested in the same environment where they've been getting their learning all along. In this group, they've had extinction in B, but now they're returned to the original fear conditioning context. And these are the results from the experiment. This is now looking at the extinction phase. This is an experiment that uses a method called conditioned suppression. No need to go into that. The main point is that we're looking at the suppression of an ongoing behavior. This is maximal suppression at the start of extinction. And then through exposure to the tone over and over, that fear goes away. Interestingly enough, we're looking at animals that are getting extinguished in A, the solid circles, and extinguished in B, the open circles. The animals in B have had a context switch, but you can see what's interesting is their extinction curve is exactly like the group that's being extinguished in the environment where they've had their fear conditioning experience. So one of the things we discovered early on is that Pavlovian learning transfers beautifully across contexts. What doesn't transfer is extinction. And these are the data from the test phase. So these guys have been extinguished in A, these in B. We now test everybody in A. The animals that have been extinguished in A continue to show very little fear, but the animals that have been extinguished in B show this big recovery of fear, a relapse effect, a return of fear that happens as soon as we start testing the tone back in the original context. It's not quite like a group that never had extinction, but you can see that this is a major effect. Fear of the tone depends on the context after extinction, and this is the kind of result that also indicates that extinction isn't the erasure of the original fear that was learned. One of the things we did fairly soon is I was a little worried about whether this kind of result was specific to the fear motivational system. This is an experiment that looks at the same kind of thing, although now we're looking at appetitive conditioning instead of fear conditioning. So now instead of being associated with shock, the tone is initially paired with food. And again, we run conditioning in context A, and then we have extinction in either the same context A or a different context, and then we're tested back in the original. And what we get is now we're looking at another index of learning. We get a nice, beautiful extinction curve in both A and B. You can see even in appetitive conditioning, food conditioning, the animals show the same extinction curve, whether they're in the same environment that conditioning happened in or in a different one. Conditioning transfers. But when we test them in A after extinction in B, you can see there's a nice bump up. That's our renewal effect in appetitive conditioning. So the two learning systems are very much alike. In fact, the renewal effect we know has enormous generality. We've studied it in lots of different methods and lots of different ways. And another thing I will say is that these experiments look at one form of renewal where conditioning happens in context A, then extinction in B, and then testing occurs back in A. But we know from other experiments that we also get renewal when we do conditioning in A, extinction in B, and then testing in C, a neutral context, ABC renewal. Or we also get it if we do conditioning in A, extinction in A, and then testing in B, or so-called AAB renewal. And that's important to me because we know that simple removal from the context is sufficient to create a renewal effect. So the animals are learning to inhibit their behavior in that extinction context, and simply going into a different context, even if it's a neutral one, is good enough to create a renewal effect. So as I say, some years ago, we started running these kinds of experiments with operant learning, and this is one of our first experiments on the renewal effect after operant extinction. So here again, now we have rats learning to lever press for food pellets in context A. Then they're extinguished in either A or a different context B. And then they're tested in A and B. And this is done within subject, but it's a counterbalanced order. So we eliminate order effects. And you can see we're asking again, is extinction in B specific to that context? This is the acquisition data. The animals are learning to lever press. We always get beautiful acquisition data in these experiments. And then we run extinction, one group in B, one group in A. Interestingly, there is a context switch effect in operant learning, which I can return to if anybody's interested in that later. But in the long run, when we do the testing, when we look at them in the extinction context B and we return them to A, wham, we get this big renewal effect again. Big deal. And in fact, this was not new when we published this result. This had been shown by lots of people. The ABA renewal effect, in fact, has become a method for looking at relapse effects in the behavioral pharmacology literature. So people are teaching animals to lever press for intravenous cocaine or heroin, and they're showing you can extinguish in a different context, and you get a big renewal or relapse effect when you go back to the original context. What is new here is AAB. So this is the condition where the animals were trained in A, extinguished in A, and now tested in A and B. And you can see that when tested in the new context, B, we do get a renewal effect, quite a bit smaller here, but big in the sense that 100% of the rats in this experiment showed it. And it was very, very, very significant. We also know in these sorts of experiments that in addition to getting AAB, we get the ABC effect again. So once again, as we move from Pavlovian respondent learning, it's removal of the response, the animal, the CS, whatever you want to study from the extinction context is sufficient to cause a renewal effect. One of the things we've done over the years is we've looked at extinction and other treatment paradigms or retroactive interference paradigms. And here's a study we did on punishment. Very, very similar. In this case, rats are trained to lever press for a food pellet in context A. Then they're switched to B. And instead of getting extinction there, we continued to reinforce the lever press response. But now one group gets a shock every once in a while when they make the lever pressing response. Another group is a yoke control group that gets the same number and temporal distribution of shocks, but these guys don't have a contingency that says if you lever press, you'll get the shock. This controls for context conditioning, context fear conditioning. But in the end, you get the drift here. The animals are tested in A and B, counterbalancing the order. So we're asking whether the punishment that we're learning in context B here is specific to that context. And these are the data, acquisition, then the punishment phase. This is in A, punishment is in B. You can see a major punishment effect, very rapid, complete suppression of the behavior. The yoke group, nope, they keep hanging in there, lever pressing. But then we test them in the end here in the punishment context and back in the original context. And you can see that in the punishment context, the animals are still completely suppressed, but we go back to context A, the original context, and they show in this experiment a very complete renewal effect. Punishment, like extinction, is highly, highly specific to the context. And I will say that just last week, Matt Broomer finished an experiment in my lab where we actually compared punishment, what we just talked about, with extinction, what we were talking about a minute ago. So Matt used the same sort of design, only now we have another group that gets trained in A to lever press for a pellet. They get extinction instead of punishment or yoked treatment in B, and then they're tested in A and B. Then these are the data hot off the computer from last week. It ended last week, takes a little more than just a day to run these experiments, but this is the acquisition phase in A, the punishment or extinction phase in B, and you can see that both punishment and extinction suppress the animals responding rather well. The yoke group as usual is fine. And then in the renewal test, the animals are tested in B and A, and you can see with either punishment or extinction as the treatment here in B, we get the same level of renewal. Not quite as high as in that previous experiment, but it is substantial, and the methods in these experiments differ a little bit. So the real point here is that punishment is no better than extinction at generating erasure or generating unlearning. It causes new learning that once again is highly, highly specific to the context. And we've shown ABA and ABC renewal in this sort of situation. So we've also done experiments like this, and this was an important experiment theoretically. It tells us something very unique about what we learn in punishment situations. It's the same kind of idea, only now we got rats learning to lever press in one context, A, and in alternating sessions, they're learning to do a different response. In this case, pulling a chain dangling from the ceiling to get pellets. And then what we did here is we simply swapped them to the other context. So now what happens is R1 trained in A is now punished in B, and R2 trained in B is now punished in A. And then we simply test both R1 and R2 in both A and B. maybe you can see one of the things that this sort of design accomplishes is both context A and B are equally associated with pellets, equally associated with acquisition, equally associated with shock, equally associated with the punishment contingency. This controls everything. The animals are learning about the context. But if we look at the test phase, what we find is kind of what you'd expect. In context A, the animals don't do R2. That's the response that's been punished there, but they do R1. But in B, they don't do R1. That's the response that was punished there, and they do R2. So there's something incredibly specific about what the animals are learning here. And what this kind of experiment tells us is that the animals are learning to suppress or inhibit a specific response in a specific context. And that is what I think punishment is really all about. We get comparable results. Travis Todd in my lab showed very comparable results with a similar design with extinction learning. So they both involve this highly specific, context-specific and response-specific sort of learning. And one of the things I'll mention here is that in this particular test, the animals can do either R1 or R2. It's a choice test. So these contextual learning kinds of things are affecting not only absolute levels of responding, but they're also influencing choice. Choice is an important thing we like to talk about when we think about voluntary behavior and operant learning. So let's move along from punishment to another kind of punishment, and what today I'm going to call abstinence learning, reinforcing abstinence. What we're actually looking at in this particular experiment is omission learning. So they all look the same, don't they? They're all the same kind of experiment. The animals in this experiment learn to lever press in context A, and then they either get extinction of the response in B, or now they get an omission contingency. And in the omission contingency, the animals now have to abstain from doing the response in order to get the pellet. So we started on, with X seconds, then we increased it, and we increased it, increased it. And by the time we ended this phase, the animals they couldn't get a pellet if they had pressed the lever as recently as 30 seconds ago. So they're learning to abstain. They're getting reinforcement for abstaining from the response they've learned. Then, of course, we run a renewal test in A and B, the same sort of method in all of these studies. We didn't stop there. We got this urge to be more complicated. And so what we did is we had another pair of groups that had the same training in the two phases, but then in the test, they also got free food pellets. Now, these are non-contingent pellets that are being presented at the same rate they were earned in acquisition, only now they're not response contingent. They're just free pellets. We knew what they would do is reinstate responding because basically they're part of the context, if you will, of acquisition, but not extinction. So talk a little bit more about that in a second, but the experiment has that additional level of complexity. If we look at the acquisition phase and the response elimination phase, you can manipulate the omission contingency in many different ways, but in this particular experiment, both extinction and omission were equally effective and equally quick at getting rid of that learned behavior. But is it erasure? Well, of course it isn't erasure. And these are the data from the test. Now it's a little complicated, but let's look first at these two groups that are being tested without any pellets. We're looking here at responding in context B, where they both of these groups learned to suppress their behavior. And now we're looking at context A. And the point here is that this is the renewal effect again, the ABA renewal effect. But notice that it doesn't matter if they've just had extinction or if they've had this learning to abstain treatment, which seems relevant to my colleagues in VCBH. Doesn't matter. Learning to abstain or the omission contingency doesn't deepen that extinction learning. It's subject to renewal just like extinction is. So it's the same story with positive punishment, and this is a case of negative punishment. If we look at the pellet test, as we call it, these are the groups that are tested with the pellets, you can see that what happens overall is the extinguished groups show this reinstatement effect. In B, they're responding more than in the no pellet condition. In A, they're responding more than in the no pellet condition. It doesn't have the same effect on the omission contingency group. Isn't that interesting? But the important thing is we also get reinstatement. we still see the renewal effect, although omission reduces this reinstating effect of the free pellets, where extinction doesn't. And that's consistent with this contextual analysis, because what's happening is these guys during the response elimination phase, they're getting a bunch of pellets. So pellets are not just connected with conditioning, they're connected with both conditioning and response elimination. The reason the extinguished group show the reinstatement effect is that the free pellets are taking them back to a part of context A. So it all makes sense. Learning is highly specific to the context. This response elimination stuff anyway is. The bottom line is it doesn't matter if we punish them or use an omission contingency. What we learn in phase 2 is very specific to that context. So to summarize what we've done so far, we've been showing that renewal after behavior change is ubiquitous. Context plays a clear role in extinction. ABA, AAB, ABC renewal effects all obtain. The context plays a similar role after several types of behavior change. And I've talked just now about extinction, punishment, and omission training. We've also looked at something called differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, which is a mouthful. Because it's such a mouthful, I didn't get to it. But it all looks very similar. The general point is behavior change does not erase the original learning. It depends at least partly on the subject learning not to make a specific response in a specific context. And just as an aside, although this is really the point of all these experiments, of course, is that renewal is a reason why treatment effects are rarely permanent. It's not the only reason, but it is a reason why treatment effects are rarely permanent and why problem behaviors seem so persistent. Relapse is very easy to obtain. And we know this because there are lots and lots of relapse effects. And my students and I over the years have looked at all of these: renewal, reinstatement, spontaneous recovery, rapid reacquisition, resurgence. We've done a lot of work on this general problem. And we think that this renewal effect, which is what I've been emphasizing right now, is basically the one that drives all of them. So the argument really is that all of these relapse effects that we know happen after behavior change are context change effects. We're doing something after the treatment that changes the context, and that treatment learning is very specific to the context. Behavior comes back if you test in a different context. Extinction learning is highly specific to its context. And another thing we've been doing a lot of work on lately is that there are lots and lots of different kinds of contexts. I've been focusing mostly on what we call exteroceptive, external contexts. Things like the apparatus a rat is in, or a room or a place, location that a person is in. But we also know that other kinds of cues, interoceptive cues, can play the role of context. So years ago, we did a lot of work on drug state as a context. So we showed that in fear extinction experiments, if you give a rat a benzodiazepine tranquilizer while they're getting exposure therapy, and then test them without the drug, you get a relapse effect, because the drug state can cause an internal context to which fear extinction will be specific. Lots of work in our lab and other labs in all these different kinds of contexts. Time, we know, is quite important after extinction. And in fact, we think of time as part of the internal context. And this is our explanation here at UVM of the spontaneous recovery effect. Just as extinction is specific to the physical context, it's specific to the temporal context. If you wait a while after extinction, as Pavlov originally showed, the response can come back. Well, we've done a lot of work lately in the lab on lots of other kinds of contexts, and I've just put them in red here. Recent behaviors, recent reinforcers, stress state can be a context. Deprivation state, whether the organism is hungry or not, can be part of the context. I'm not going to have time to show you the experiments that we've been doing on these things, but in the long run, the notion here again is that this thing we're calling context can be lots and lots of different things. So we're talking about effects that I think are enormously general. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I haven't had time to put these in my talk today, but there are a couple of recent papers that review this, and they also review the literature on all those other relapse effects. And this paper with Steve Marin and Gavin McNally is especially interesting because it does all that And it also reviews the neuroscience of extinction learning, if you're interested. But at this point, what I want to do is turn a corner and now talk about this goal-directed action and habit thing I mentioned. And I want to just say that the field has become very, very interested in the fact that instrumental or voluntary behaviors, operant behaviors, come in two varieties. And these are these things I'm calling goal-directed actions and habits. And a lot of the original thinking on this is linked with Tony Dickinson, a good friend at Cambridge, and Bernard Belain, who's doing a lot of work on this now, and he's now at the University of New South Wales, another friend of mine. But basically, rats and Skinner boxes are lever pressing, and this is our model for thinking about voluntary behavior. Sometimes that behavior directed at the lever, or our behaviors, of course, in real life, are very goal-directed, very deliberate. They depend on knowledge of the relationship between the action or the behavior and the outcome, the reinforcer or the goal. So we say in the vocabulary of the field, they depend on an association between the response and the outcome. They also depend on our knowledge of the goal's value. How valuable is that goal object to you? If it's valuable, then you go off and do the behavior that you've learned leads to it. Habits, on the other hand, are not nearly as cognitive. They're much more automatic, mechanical, and mindless. Instead of involving us processing or thinking about the value of the goal or the goal at all, we simply do those responses in the presence of cues that are present. SR, bang, we're not thinking about the goal. Habits become evident after lots and lots of repetition of a behavior or lots and lots of practice. And another thing we know about them is that learning habit is facilitated or speeded up by exposure to drugs of abuse. So partly because of this, habits have become an important part of our thinking about what addictions are about. And the notion is that addictions involve habit. You just do the behavior. A smoker does the behavior, not necessarily because he or she is interested in the goal of nicotine, but because they've just done that behavior a million times in the presence of those cues. Automatic, mechanical, mindless responding. Well, how do we distinguish these things scientifically in the lab? Well, goal-directed actions, because the reinforcer is so important, the goal is so important, they're sensitive to something I'm going to identify now as the reinforcer devaluation effect, whereas habits are insensitive to the reinforcer devaluation effect. They don't depend on our valuation of the reinforcer at all. We just do them automatically. So how do we study that? Well, there are a couple methods, but one that we use in the lab, and lots of other people do too, is animals are initially trained to lever press for a food pellet or whatever response you want to study. And then we divide them into two groups who separately, they're not able to lever press in this phase. They get the pellet and it's paired with an injection of lithium chloride. Now, lithium chloride is something that makes the animal sick temporarily. And you might know from previous courses that this conditions a taste aversion to the pellet. Because it's associated several times with getting sick, the animal comes to reject the pellet, and we've reduced its value. We've devalued the pellet by pairing it with sickness. The control group gets the same exposures to pellet and the same doses of lithium chloride, but in an unpaired way. So the animal in this case does not associate the pellet with getting sick, doesn't learn an aversion. This doesn't devalue the reinforcer. And in the final test, what we do is we allow them to make the response in extinction. And if they've learned that the pellet means lithium chloride, if they've learned that they no longer value it, this is what they do. If the behavior is a goal-directed action, the devaluation procedure makes them respond much less than the control condition that has not had reinforcer devaluation. You think about that, that's kind of miraculous. I think this is actually an incredibly interesting effect, because the thing to remember here is the animal we never give the animal an opportunity to associate and experience this action with the outcome. it's been completely separately devalued. So when they do this, they're responding because they remember that the action leads to the outcome and that they no longer like that outcome. And that's a goal-directed action. By definition, a goal-directed action depends on how much you value the goal. And this very physically, clearly demonstrates that. A habit, on the other hand, is identified because this devaluation procedure has no impact. The animal isn't processing the goal when it's making that automatic response out of habit. And we know that because we don't get the reinforcer devaluation effect. So this is how we can identify goal-directed actions and habits. And my student, Mike Steinfeld, came up with this cartoon, which I love to show. When an animal is lever pressing because it's a goal-directed action, they're somehow processing the goal. We know that because if we make the goal worse through taste aversion, they know they stop. The animal's responding out of habit, though. That thought balloon is empty. They're just lever pressing. They're not processing the goal. And this is how it works, of course, in humans as well. So what creates a habit? Well, there are a few ideas about it. Not many ideas, actually. One that's popular in the social psychology of habit learning is the law of effect, which goes back to Edward Thorndike in 1911. An SR habit association is stamped in with every reinforcement. That's pretty old, and I think we can do better than that. Tony Dickinson has something we call the rate correlation view. It's very different, but his notion is that habits form when the correlation between behavior rate and reward rate becomes low. And this happens with lots of practice because what happens is behavior rate becomes quite regular, so there's no change in it and there's no variation in the reward rate. So this is an intuitive understanding of how the rate correlation view works. Our view here at UVM is a little different. We are arguing now that habits develop when the reinforcer becomes predictable, not necessarily because of the low correlation or not just because the reinforcer is stamped in an SR association. What happens is over practice, as the reinforcer becomes more and more predictable, we are more likely to pay less attention to the behavior. We're more likely to tune the behavior out, and that's when it becomes habitual. What we're doing here is extending what we know of the Pierce-Hall model of attention in Pavlovian learning. This is an old model, but it's a very valuable model, and we think it might apply here. What John Pierce and Jeff Hall have been talking about for years is the notion that in a simple conditioning experiment, when a tone is associated with food, as learning continues and the food is more and more predicted, there is evidence that the animals will start tuning the tone out. They pay less and less attention to the predictor once the predicted event is highly predicted. Why not? Why should you pay a lot of attention to something you already know the meaning of? What we're arguing is that maybe the same happens with our behavior. The better the outcome is predicted, why bother processing it? Start tuning out your behavior. When you do, when you're not paying attention to what you're doing, that is the condition. That is habit. So where does this all go? Where did this take us? Well, this is a bit geeky here, but basically we had to start using a new procedure to start studying this kind of thing. And this is a situation that Eric Threlkill and other investigators in the lab and I developed. It's basically a simple, you might just recognize it as a discriminated operant learning situation. A tone comes on every once in a while for 30 seconds. And only in that tone is lever pressing, the response reinforced. Okay, so that's the little red dots mean, that's a reinforcer. Animals will learn to do that. Everything's great, but this was new. Nobody had actually been studying this kind of effect in the field of habit learning. And to us, it had a major advantage because now we can look at responding to a trigger cue. If you think of the tone that way, the tone sort of triggers this response out of habit. And this is more like habits in everyday life, we argue, which are triggered by proximate cues. So that's one reason we got into this. But what we wound up doing is comparing this condition with this condition, where now the animals still get as many tones and so on and so forth. In the long run, they'll get as many reinforcers, but only a random half of the tones have a reinforcer in them. This doesn't look very random, but it was programmed randomly. So this is now a partial reinforcement procedure where the tone half the time says that a reinforcer will happen, but then half the time a reinforcer doesn't happen in the tone. Well, why is this interesting? Well, the Peirce-Hall attention rule tells us that basically uncertain reinforcers, as in the 50% case, will maintain attention, whereas predictable reinforcers, as in the 100% condition, every tone tells the animal that a reinforcer will happen. Those are not going to maintain attention. So if our application of this Peirce-Hall rule to operant behavior is right, we might expect habit learning here, but not here, because this is going to maintain attention to both the cue and perhaps the behavior. We can't tune it out as readily when the reinforcer is less predictable. So just to remind you, what we do in these experiments is the animals learn something in phase one. Here they're learning either these kinds of discriminations. Then we separately pair the pellet with getting sick in one group and not in the other. And then we're going to test the animal back with the tone in extinction. And in the long run, this is the kind of result that we get. This is simply learning to respond in the tone versus a baseline period, pre-tone. And both groups, continuous and partial reinforcement groups, are learning just fine. And then remember, then in a phase I'm not going to show you here, the animals get devaluation, either pellet paired with lithium chloride or unpaired with lithium chloride. And then we test them in extinction. And what we have here is gorgeous evidence of action learning here, because if you think about it, the animals in the devalued condition are suppressing their behavior in the presence of a tone compared to the non-devalued group. And what we have here is an action. Okay, so the animals are responding because they know, the argument goes, that the response leads to pellet in the tone, until we come along and they value that pellet, until we come along and screw things up by conditioning a taste aversion to the tone. So this is a goal-directed action. But notice the story's different with the continuous reinforcement group. Here we don't see any suppression of the responding after the reinforcer has been devalued. And what we have here is evidence of habit, which is to say that, yeah, the more predictable reinforcer is the one that led to habit. The less certain, more unpredictable reinforcer in the partial reinforcement condition didn't. So we've extended this and replicated this. I don't want to spend too much on this, but we basically shortened the cues in a more recent paper and run the same kind of condition. And if we just jump to the test, we see the same kind of result. Animals that get this uncertain, unpredictable treatment show an action after lots and lots of training. The group that gets this predictable reinforcer, always reinforced on 100% of the tones, does not show a devaluation effect. In fact, here it looks like there's a trend in the opposite way, but this is clear evidence not of action, but of habit. So we get similar results, in this case with a stimulus that's 1/5 as long as the one in the previous work and a reinforcement rate that's 10 times as rich. So we think this is a very general effect. So making habits. Habit learning occurs when the reinforcer becomes predictable. This is the kind of thing suggested by these results. It's prevented when the reinforcer stays unpredictable, as in our 50% reinforcement schedule. Consistent with theories of attention and learning, namely the Peirce-Hall model, though nobody had pointed this out before. This is an idea we've been thinking about for a long time around here, but now we have evidence that it might be true. Habit learning happens when we can tune out a behavior. Goal-directed actions are ones that we're tuned into. This is a prediction from models of attention and learning. So I would just point out that this is a more flexible view of actions and habits than the prevailing view or the dogma in the field. We don't think that habit is necessarily a fixed endpoint, which is implied but not always said by theories of habit learning. And one implication of this new way of thinking about actions versus habits is that we might be able to turn a habit back into an action again if we make the reinforcer surprising again. Okay, when it's predictable, it's unsurprising. Maybe when we make it surprising again, we'll be able to get rid of habit and turn the behavior back into action. This kind of result had been shown in previous work in Pavlovian learning, testing the Peirce-Hall model. So we weren't coming out of a vacuum. But that's what we do. We now study how we can break habits. And this is an early experiment in our series. We tested the idea that what happens when we make the reinforcer surprising at the end of habit training. Sorry, these always look complicated, but of course they're very simple. In this situation, the animals get a whole lot of sessions, almost 14, but only 13. I don't know how I let 13 happen. I'm kind of superstitious about things like this in the lab. But animals had 13 daily sessions of simple operant training, just free operant training without that discriminative tone stimulus. Habits are easy to form there. The control group gets lots of sessions to acquire a habit with. Then they get that devaluation treatment of either the reinforcer paired or unpaired with lithium. And then we're going to test behavior. Is it an action or a habit? Well, this is enough training. We hoped it would produce a habit. But this group gets the same first 12 sessions of lever press paired with O1, but then in the 13th session for these characters, they now get O2, a sucrose pellet if this was a grain pellet, or a grain pellet if this had been a sucrose pellet. That's a surprising outcome. So the theory would suggest that maybe this would re-engage attention. Now we do the same devaluation treatment. And the hypothesis is that maybe we'll show habit here, but if we give the animals the surprising reinforcer at the end of their training, we'll have an action. Can a habit be reconverted to action? And of course, I wouldn't be here talking about this experiment if it couldn't be. So these are just the acquisition data, nothing super interesting here. This is the day where they get either O2, the new thing, or O1. Then they get taste aversion learning to O1, and this is the test now in extinction. You can see in the control condition, there's really no difference between the devalued and the non-devalued groups. So that's evidence of habit. But look at what we get with the group that had the surprising O2 at the end of habit training. Here there clearly is suppressed behavior in the devalued condition and the non-devalued condition. And that is evidence of an action. We have taken a habit and reconverted it into a goal-directed action. So the idea here is that a surprising outcome for the behavior at the end of habit training can return habit to action. Habit learning is not fixed and permanent. We've shown that we can do the same thing with other kinds of manipulations. So here's another experiment where now the surprising reinforcers are presented just before the test rather than at the end of the habit training phase. So here we have animals that got 20 sessions of behavior leading to outcome 1. Then they had a reinforcer devaluation treatment, same as usual. And then a control group was simply tested for R. We knew that with a lot of this acquisition training, as much as we gave here, that this behavior should be a habit. There should be no reinforcer devaluation effect. But this new condition gets a surprising pre-feeding with O2, an irrelevant food pellet. Sucrose if O1 was grain, grain if O1 was sucrose. They get it for 30 minutes. They can chomp down on this stuff. This is exciting. This is great. But now, after they get that pre-feeding with O2, we test the response and what's going to happen. Well, what happens is, if you look at the controls, this is the test. There's no devaluation effect in the controls, indicating that our behavior was a habit. The animals are continuing to respond, even though they know the pellet isn't good. They don't like it. They have a complete aversion to the pellet. But the animals that have been pre-fed on this irrelevant kind of food, bang, they're now showing action again. So habits return to action status if a surprising reinforcer is presented just before the test. So I think we're in kind of a new way of thinking about actions and habits, at least for the animal learning field. And then the last couple of experiments I want to show you might not surprise you. What about changing the context? You might have gotten the impression that this is one of our favorite things to do. Well, yeah, of course. These are some experiments that Michael Steinfeld and I ran. And what we did is we initially trained in context A, an action, lever pressing, for 3 sessions. We knew that this minimal amount of training would not move them into habit mode. There would still be an action here. But then we moved them into context B, and now the same response is trained for 12 more sessions, which should convert that behavior into a habit. So we've had behavior trained as an action here, now converted into a habit here. Then we do reinforcer devaluation, and we test the response in both the habit learning context and the original action learning context. And what we get is this. In the context where habit had been trained, the behavior is a habit. It is not suppressed by this reinforcer devaluation treatment. On the other hand, when we test them in context A, they do show suppression when the behavior has been devalued. Sorry, when the reinforcer has been devalued, that behavior is an action. So when we've converted the behavior into a habit in B, we can get renewal of action when we go back to A. We also did an experiment that's even crazier, but it worked. Once again, the animals had action training in A, the behavior is converted into a habit in B, then they got reinforcer devaluation, and then they're tested both in the habit context where habit has been learned, but now they're also tested in context C. This is a new context. Actually, the animals have had a lot of exposure to it, so it's not novel, but it is new. It's neither been associated with habit or action learning. So what's going to happen here? Well, when we look at the test data, we get a very similar kind of set of outcomes. In B, where the behavior was converted into a habit, the behavior looks like a habit. But in C, this irrelevant third new context, it's an action. So in the context where habit is trained, the behavior retains its habit status. But in a new context, never associated with the behavior before, the habit turns into an action. So we're getting ABA renewal and ABC renewal of action after habit learning. So the bottom line is that action renews with context change after habit learning. We know from these results and other results that we've gotten is that habit learning is more context specific than action. That's how we have to imagine this works to explain these results. And we know that action learning actually transfers beautifully across contexts with systematic looks at behavior and reinforcer devaluation effects. So I just want to make the point, and this is really sort of the last point I want to make, that we've just come full circle, haven't we? You know, we talked about extinction before, and the point really is that the action to habit conversion is like extinction. The habit learning doesn't erase action, but it interferes with it in a context-specific way. And we like to think that what we've been stumbling around looking at here is really what turns out to be a very, very general principle of associative learning. And that's basically this: if we train a behavior associating it with an outcome, and we run either extinction or punishment, omission or now habit, what we can get is renewal effects, all of these kinds of effects, all of which are consistent with the fact that the second thing learned here is more context specific than the first thing learned. That's the asymmetry that drives all of these relapse effects and all of these, this is not erasure type effect. So in the long run, what I'd like to propose is something simple like this. And this is really an idea about how action and habit learning might operate that's based on what we know about extinction and other forms of retroactive interference. We learn a goal-directed action, and then we learn with additional training that the behavior is a habit. Habit doesn't erase action learning, but it instead inhibits it, just as we think extinction inhibits prior learning. The crucial new thing is that the habit learning is highly context specific. So when you're in the habit context, you get habitual behavior. But if you're in a different context, this is not activated, and what you get is renewal of action. So ultimately, what we seem to have is something that strikes me as fundamentally flexible and adaptive. Basically, when you're in the habit context, you respond automatically. This frees your working memory to process other kinds of things like, what are you going to do tonight? What are you going to do this afternoon? But then when you're out of that context, bang, behavior comes action again. And now you can learn about new contingencies. So this just seems to me to be the way things might be organized. And I will say, if it's organized that way, it has a different kind of implication for what we think about addictions. Ultimately, I think the point of these last experiments has been that habit is not permanent. It's not fixed. It can go away. Action can be renewed. And so when we think about addiction, if habit's playing a role in addiction, it's probably because the switch between them, which I'm kind of modeling here, becomes sticky or maybe stuck. It's not because habit is permanent. The switch becomes sticky. So ultimately, that's all I really want to say. I'll just summarize quickly, very simply, what I've shown you today is basically behavior change is never erasure. That's true of lots of extinction research, punishment research, other forms of retroactive interference. It's extremely sensitive to the context, and you'll have to take my word for it. The context can be lots of different kinds of things. That would be a different talk. The point I'm making here finally is that action and habit conversion is very, very similar. Habit doesn't erase goal direction. It interferes with it in a context-specific way. Boom. And ultimately, we think that habit learning itself occurs when conditions allow us to tune our behavior out. That is what we define as a habit. So thanks for all your attention. And I like to say, stay tuned. And I'd like to just say that these are the recent grad students and postdoc that have contributed so much to this work. And that's all I've got to say. I ought to thank also NIH or the National Institute on Drug Abuse for supporting what we're doing. So I think I'll stop there.
Hey, Mark, thanks for that very, very formative and stimulating lecture. So we have 9 questions sitting here waiting for you. We're a little tight on time, so let's try and get through them, but you might want to keep your answers brief. So I'm going to start with those that came in. Oh, they had been in temporal order, but I'll just start at what's the top for me. Question: is this why contingency management programs can work for people around substance use change?
Well, I mean, this is a big question. And of course, yeah, we think that these processes are going to probably be involved in contingency management. So a point that we would make is that we need to be aware that, of course, these original kinds of learning that we're treating with contingency management, the core of which is to reinforce abstinence, kind of what we've been modeling in the lab sometimes. That never goes away. It can come back. So what you need to do, I would say, based on our work, is worry about the context, worry about the generalization of the treatment to new kinds of contexts.
And someone would just want a little bit of clarification of how you're distinguishing contexts. For example, context A from B, just characteristically, how do you distinguish between them?
Well, as I say, context can be many things, but in our typical experiment where we're looking at physical kinds of contexts, we have different Skinner boxes, literally Skinner boxes. We still study Skinner boxes in the lab. They are in different locations in space in the lab. They have different odors. They have different floors. The animals are standing on staggered grids or, parallel grids. They have different visual cues and so on and so forth. We make them as maximally different as we can, but we really haven't studied which of those many different features is the crucial one. We assume that they're all important.
Okay, here's another. Is it possible to extinguish a conditioned inhibitor?
That's a good question. That's a classic problem in the field, actually. So there are a lot of people that say no. You can't take a safety signal that tells you that you're not going to get a shock and just extinguish it with presenting it over and over and over. You can extinguish it by a non-extinction manipulation if you pair it with shock, for example. So you take the safety signal and make it an active danger signal. That'll get rid of the inhibition, although I don't think it would get rid of the inhibition permanently, that you would get another renewal effect. And in fact, we might have done that. I have a student in my remote past named Chuck Peck, who I think studied that. We would get renewal of inhibition even in that case. So that sounds like a learning theorist in the audience.
Yes, it does. Regarding interoceptive context for relapse effects, what type of hormonal states have you examined? Have you looked at stress hormones?
We have not done that kind of work, but there is an interest in primarily estrogen work. It was Dave Riccio's lab that was doing things like that. Estrogen isn't particularly effective, but things like ACTH and things like that do have contextual kinds of properties.
Okay. Given that behavior change effects can be context specific, have you ever tried training across a number of varying contexts to see if training across contexts will produce more enduring effects?
That's a great question. And we have done that with sort of mixed success. So to be honest, when we were looking at fear extinction, that was a clear prediction that we'd set up. When we studied fear extinction in multiple contexts, that in our hands did not get rid of the renewal effect. But it turns out that other research has suggested that if you do it combined with enough extinction in each of those contexts, that can help. We do know from our operant experiments that if we train an operant in multiple contexts, it's far more likely to generalize to a new context. So if you think of the treatment phase as something that's training new operant behaviors, new voluntary behaviors, the more contexts those are trained in, we have very strong evidence that that will enhance generalization to new contexts. So that's one of the things that we're very interested in doing more research on at some point. So that's a good idea, and I would say that's a way to go.
Mm-hmm. So here's one, I think, looking for gradients. Have you tried to test extinction by playing around with context similarity? Would the renewal be stronger if extinction occurs in a very different context compared to a more similar context?
That's another great question. And of course, I think it would have to work that way, but we have not actually done that. So there's some old experiments from Michael Fanslow's lab and Jerry Rudy's lab at Colorado with contextual fear conditioning, which is not the same, but you can fiddle with your contexts and make some more different than others. And that ought to make a difference, but we have not directly studied that with the renewal effect.
Here's someone who wants to quibble a little bit theoretically for suggesting that habits are important in addiction. They would argue that habits do not play an especially important role in human addiction. Habits develop in rat self-administration studies, but are an artifact of how these experiments are done, which require the animal to make the same response again and again to get drug. But this is not the case with people. The critical feature of addiction is the pathological motivation to seek drugs when they are not immediately available, not the ritualized habits seen when taking them. So there's
I'm very sympathetic to that. I'm very sympathetic to that argument. I think that based on the findings that we've been getting, I'm less inclined to think that habit's going to play the kind of role that people sometimes say it will. And in fact, you can argue, and Lee Hogarth is now arguing this over in Britain, that addictions might be the reverse of habit learning. What happens is you just wind up with a highly, highly valued outcome, the drug, that is more motivating for a goal-directed action. So I'm completely sympathetic to the question. I think on that particular kind of argument that reaches that conclusion, I think we could probably quibble. I mean, if you think of smoking, smoking to me is a case that looks like habit. I know a lot more about smokers than people that abuse other drugs, to be honest. But you just think about the number of cigarettes, 2-pack a day smoker. Do people still smoke 2 packs a day? I don't know, but that's thousands and thousands of trials a year. And ultimately, they're often in the same context, and they are very ritualistic kinds of behaviors that develop. So I don't think they're quite as variable as the question seems to imply necessarily.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you. Okay, relating to the first question above, I'm not clear what the first question above is, but how different do the contexts have to be for the context to be considered different? So I think this is again, about the gradients, maybe.
Yeah, it's a gradients question, and they have to be different. We've never we've never studied that systematically, and I don't find that at all irrelevant. I think that's very, very important. But I think our assumption, just based on everything we know about stimulus control and so on and so forth, tells us that there will be a gradient, that there are gradients for every kind of cue that's been tested. And as I say, the evidence with straight contextual fear conditioning, where we're just looking at animals freezing in the presence of contexts that have been associated with shock, which is slightly different, you can get gradients. So, you know, I'm a great believer that contexts are very complex stimuli that are composed of Carl Sagan's billions and billions of different elements. And it's going to be a question of overlap. How many of those elements change is going to be a way to approach the generalization question.
Okay, and we'll, excuse me, we'll wrap up with what's an observation, but you can comment on it, Mark. In terms of addiction, it would be interesting to include social context.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that that's a huge factor, isn't it? Certainly in social species like us. And there have been a couple of experiments that look at social contexts in rats. So you can look at extinction in the presence of a rat in a cage next to the Skinner box where you're getting extinction. And yep, social cues matter.
Absolutely.
I think I have that on my list. But yes, I absolutely, very, very important.
All right, well, that wraps it up. Mark, thank you so much for this really informative and interesting talk. And thanks to our audience. People have hung in through the Q&A, and thank you for both. Or thank you both, audience and speaker. And this wraps up the fall semester. That actually wraps up the 2021 lecture series, but we will be back in action come the spring semester. And Nicole, if you're still with us, do you know what date? I don't happen to know what date we're back in action.
We are back on, I will tell you right now. We are back on Wednesday, January 19th.
Great. Well, I
With
hope to see
Len
many.
Epstein. Yep.
Oh, right, Len Epstein. I think Len was on in the audience today. So Mark, we hope you're in the audience next time on the 19th.
I'll try to be there. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
And Len, we're looking forward to your lecture, and we hope everyone else in the audience can join us for Len's, what I'm sure is going to also be a very stimulating lecture. So thanks to everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we're going to sign off now.
Thank you very much.
Great.